Well, hello and welcome back to Overheard Overnight. I'm Chris Morales. And today is Tuesday, December the 3rd, and I'm pleased to be joined this afternoon by Dean Love. And the reason Dean is here today goes back to something that my grandmother was very fond of saying. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. On my darkest times, I remember listening to that advice and reminding myself of that. But nothing prepared me for the story that Dean shared recently. And The Value of Resilience and Hard Lessons Learned is the title of it. And in it, it's a pretty graphic story on the details of his life, the things that changed him and made him. And he talks about how he's learned resilience in the hard times as well as right through until today. Essentially, it comes down to this: choices. We've all got choices. Even in the darkest times, we all have choices. Dean, I'm moved by your story because it's raw and it exposes the painful experiences you lived through. And excuse the cliche, but you're still standing, man. You're still here. You're still with us. You're still moving forward. How did you come to the decision to write and then share this story?
Well, I would say there isn't just one thing. I mean, I lived all of this. And I would say over the past number of years, I've engaged in a few things to try and figure myself out. Uh, and I've taken career counseling a couple of different times. Didn't really help. And I've always had a fondness for writing, and I've always just been able to string a sentence together now and then. And I love the magic of storytelling. So I started to write on Substack a while back. In fact, I started to write on medium.com about 4 years ago, I would say. And I've been sporadically doing that, and I just find it to be a very expressive means of communicating and a way to get some thoughts out and just something I just love to do. So I thought at one point it might be this, all of this lived experience I thought might translate into a good story. But beyond that, I do lots of reading and I listen to some podcasts and whatnot. And I was sort of searching for a way to tie all this stuff together. And I stumbled across a particular episode of Rainn Wilson's podcast where Ryan Holiday was on it. And I listened to Ryan Holiday's podcast about Stoicism, which I know you do as well. So do millions of other people. And I just thought, well, this actually sort of bridges it. And this becomes a good introduction for this story that I just wanted to write about anyway. And that's not to say that I think I have this amazing story that nobody else can match. And it's not me saying I'm better or stronger or smarter than anyone. In fact, if I was smarter, I think most of this stuff wouldn't have happened in the first place. And it was just something that I wanted to express and put out there. And I thought that maybe I might be able to help some people. And, even if I reach one person, a few people, and you can engage with them or help them feel seen, help them feel understood, help them relate to it in some way, uh, that was enough for me.
I
And
see.
it became something that I thought, well, I can write a story about this. When I write something and publish it, really it comes down to there's no, I don't have a grand plan for all of this other than I want to write about what I think I can sink my teeth into and write something worthwhile reading, really.
So, Dean, why don't you dive in and tell us maybe not the whole story, but certainly start at the beginning of where the story started for you in terms of putting ink to paper or, typing
Sure.
keys to bits and bytes of a computer.
Yeah, it actually starts quite a long time ago, and there's some things that happened in my family that I think some people can relate to, and some people, it'll kind of blow their hair back a little bit because it's not necessarily typical for everyone, although lots of it probably is. So I think maybe it's sort of best told in a chronological kind of way. So if I start where this whole thing started, which by the way, this first event, I did not actually know much about, if anything at all, until I was in my 20s and moved home. Um, in kind of a broken state. So in 1956, long before I was born, something tragic happened on my mother's farm. So my mother grew up on a farm. There was a family of six children, two adults. The oldest was my uncle Joey, who was 16 at the time, and he wanted to go swimming with his friends one summer afternoon during harvest. He was next in line to run the family. He was the oldest in the family and, sort of granddad's right-hand man. And granddad needed him on the farm that day, but my grandmother talked him into letting my uncle go swimming, and which he did with some friends to a local, a lake or a watering hole of sorts, a body of water close to the family farm. We grew up about 3.5 hours northwest of where I live on the prairies here in Manitoba. And he went swimming, and he was a strong swimmer, but two or three of his friends weren't. One of them got into trouble with an undertow and was panicking and having some trouble. From what I remember, a second boy went in after him to pull him out. He also got into trouble, so Joey went in after them. And they were overwhelmed by the situation, and he drowned. All of them drowned that day in 1956, which is tragic enough. But as a result of that, my grandmother felt so guilty, so overcome with grief, with guilt, that she decided the only way out for her, out of this tremendous sense of guilt, grief, uh, everything that she felt, she decided to take her own life.
Hmm.
And it was within, a short period of all that traumatic incident on the farm. And then the next day, my mother, who was not even 10 years old at the time, and one of her sisters found their mother hanging in the family barn by her neck. So she had decided to hang herself in the family barn. So that sort of set about a chain of events in motion that, as I say in the story, rippled through our lives for decades, which is absolutely true. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around that, but I'll sort of highlight some of those things. So that was the first thing that sort of happened in my family. And this happened before I was born, but of course, it deeply affected my mother and all her siblings. And they never really dealt with it probably properly. I mean, this is the 50s we're talking about. This is the prairies. This is Manitoba. They were farmers. The resources just weren't available. They were not near a major center. They were hours away. So they dealt with it as best they could. My grandfather at one point remarried a woman much younger than he was. He needed some help on the farm and needed some help raising the children. And I'm sure that fed into the decision to do so. That caused a pretty major shift in the family dynamic. And as a result, we never really came together. They did have children. After my grandfather died in the early 70s, she remarried. And, we are related to them through that relationship, but we never, as a whole family, never really came together, although I, have come back into contact with them over the years. Mom never really dealt with that. And I have a younger brother and a half brother who I did not grow up with, an older half brother. So this sort of, she fought with depression her whole life. And it sort of came and went, and it was always kind of looming in the background like a shadow. After my younger brother was born in the early 70s, my grandfather, her father, my maternal grandfather died. He was ill. He was not a young man by this point. He was getting close to his 70s at that point. Um, and my mother was very close to her father, as you can imagine. And the trauma of that sent her into, easiest way to describe it would be a depression. So she was sent into the next sort of largest center in my
Hmm.
province of Manitoba, and she underwent shock therapy.
Hmm.
But this was several hours, a couple hours from where we lived at the time. So I was 3 years old, roughly. My younger brother was literally just a baby, a few months old, and mom was suddenly in the hospital and couldn't take care of us. So dad had to enlist the help of family, and he had to work his job, and he had to provide for the family, keep the house running, and all of that stuff while he had an infant, a 3-year-old,
Hmm.
and his wife in the hospital in undergoing shock therapy, which in itself would have been traumatic, I expect. So I never knew much about that until I was a bit older, and dad always just said, well, she had trouble with her nerves.
Hmm.
And there's an understatement if ever there was one. Um, so after that happened, we sort of, I have good memories of my younger years. I would say for the most part, my dad was an intense guy, a hard living man, an alcoholic. And he would have said a damn good one if you'd asked him. But he was an intense guy. He worked hard, lived hard, did what he wanted. He was born in the early 40s to my grandparents very late. My grandmother was 47 when he was born.
Mm.
And he always told me this story. And I remember my grandmother well, but she died when I was about 12. She had a stroke and she never quite recovered from that. And she was well in her 80s at that point. So he always just told me that she nearly died giving birth to him. And this was 1942. So, and they lived in a very small place. He was on the farm. My grandfather fought in World War One, came home, started the farm and other business. So they were busy. So dad was left on his own quite a lot, and he was pretty wild and kind of did what he wanted, when he wanted, how he wanted, and never managed money very well, and had some, had an identity that he built for himself. Um, so we lived through all of that period. My parents met in the late 60s, had my brother and I. All of that happened. And I have some great memories of that period for the most part. In the mid 80s, my father was in farm equipment. The interest rates skyrocketed for everyone. And being in, agriculture, high risk. And I don't remember what the interest rates were, but I know they were double digits and probably approaching 20% at one point. So, of course, we had a mortgage, we had debt. Dad sort of spent money faster than he could possibly make it, and he made a good living in those days, supporting his family. My mother didn't work until I was well into my teenage years, and she didn't need to. So we were fortunate in that respect. But we had to they had to file for bankruptcy in the mid 80s, which was a big deal for us. It's devastating for my dad. At one point, we had a boat. He had a convertible, his van. He drove a van, a full-size van, and we had my mother's car, and we had a house. And we went on holidays, and we did all this stuff, and dad did what he wanted.
Mhm.
That suddenly came to a crashing end, and he never really recovered from that. He was never quite the same after that, and we all knew it. And that set about a chain of events in motion that stayed in place really right up until my father died in 2006.
Mm.
Um, so after that, we moved. Mom and dad moved around quite a bit. Um, he was never the same, as I said. He never really came right out and said it, but I knew when I got to be a bit older, I was in my teenage years at this point, he'd felt that he'd failed us.
Mm.
And he never really recovered from that. He was at that he was kind of a shell of his former self. The confidence that drove him just wasn't there. He was kind of shattered and broken. And he never really fully recovered in that sense. So there was a lot of instability throughout those years, and his alcoholism got worse. He never stopped drinking really ever, and he was a heavy smoker,
Mm.
and never really looked after himself all that well. And the older you get, the harder that is, of course. So mom and dad moved quite a bit. My younger brother stayed at home with them. I left the house in about 1992. I went out to the West Coast and proceeded to try and build a life for myself. I wanted to get on the radio like my father was when he was younger.
Mm.
And I got myself into, I mean, I had a great time, but I also got myself into some trouble. I met a girl who was not good for me. And I was young and stupid, naive, been insecure, very naive, I would say. And I ran into somebody who was smarter than me, a manipulator, probably a bit narcissistic. And she lied about being pregnant, which I didn't find out until later. And we got married in a rush, and I thought I was going to do the right thing. She was also an alcoholic, an intense person who was a problem.
Mhm.
And at one point, she wanted me to cut off communication from my parents when my mother was in the hospital and undergoing depression, or about to go into the hospital being treated for another depression. Prior to that, my parents moved to a small community. Dad lost his job again, and they bought a small house. Mom was really happy. She had a house in this community I was born in, where my parents actually met. She was close to
Mm.
one of her sisters who was still alive. And I forgot to mention this, but prior to that, prior to me moving home or leaving home in the very late 80s, early 90s, one of her sisters actually took her life as well. So that was the second of three suicides in my mother's family. So she was undergoing also a very severe depression. Her marriage broke up, her kids were out of the house, lots of stuff going on. You never really knew it. She was a very, very stoic woman and very smart, very strong. quiet, great sense of humor. We never knew that she was suffering at all, but
Mhm.
she was. She took her own life as well when I was fairly young. I wasn't even 20 years old, probably. Fast forward a bit. So I was in on the West Coast, just in an absolute disaster of a situation. My mother was in the hospital undergoing depression, not being honest with the doctors. Things were kind of spinning out of control, and things kind of came to a head when my mother had decided that the only way out for her to escape what she was dealing with um, would be what her mother and her sister did before her, which was to take her own life. So my mother hanged herself in the apartment that my parents were living in when she was home part time on the weekends. I think at that point, it's a little bit fuzzy. I was, half a country away, living on the West Coast. And I had my own issues to deal with, and I was just in a real bad way, real bad situation, financially, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the whole the whole work. So when my mother died, it was, as you can imagine, pretty traumatic. And that, my mother was the glue that held everything together. And when she died, many things died with her. And it was very difficult for my father, as you can imagine. I was in a real mess. I have cousins that live out there. One of them has since passed on, but I had two cousins, brothers came, picked me up, put me on a plane, sent me home. And I moved home with dad and lived with him. I moved in, I was, in my mid 20s at this point, and I had to rebuild from scratch. I moved home with a duffel bag, a pair of broken glasses, a pair of jeans, and a couple sweaters. My guitars, everything I'd had, my car, everything was left out there. Like it was literally like sneak him out in the middle of the night kind of deal. And they put me on a plane and I started over at about 26, in my mid 20s. Um, and then I just kept going. Didn't really realize at the time I had built myself an identity built on all this stuff subconsciously. I was not truly 100% aware of, which I didn't find out until, years later, fairly recently, in fact, after undergoing some training and some and a transformational program of sorts. So I just kept going. I did kind of what dad did. I just did what I had to do. I went full throttle and I did what I had to do. And I started working part-time jobs. I had three of them at one time. And then I got into sales again, which I had done on the coast. And I just kept going. And I ended up working super hard. And I sort of rebuilt myself, as it were, through a number of different things, working hard, reintegrating myself with friends that I had left here that I hadn't talked to for a while and all of that sort of stuff, and lived with my dad for a while. So I decided that it was time for me to move out of dad's apartment. I was in my mid to late 20s by this point. It's a couple of years later. I'm like, I got to get out of here. And I love
So,
my dad.
Dean, I have a question for you after all
Anything.
that.
Yeah.
Did you ever think that there was another option instead of getting up and picking yourself up and moving forward? Did you ever think about that?
But no, certainly knew there were, I lived on the eighth floor when I lived with dad. We lived on the eighth floor in an apartment building, and there was a balcony on this apartment. So, I looked down eight stories up, and we lived on the riverbank.
Hmm.
So on one side was the parking lot, the other side was the riverbank. So I mean, I could have certainly there was another option available to me if I chose to take it, I suppose. Don't know if that would have been enough, but I think a fall from eight stories probably do it for most
Hmm.
people. So certainly I knew that was there, but I never seriously considered it.
Hmm.
There were certainly times, Chris, where things were it looked like I was never going to get out of this mess, no matter what. I just felt, it was just a complete collapse of everything I'd known. Like, as there was no, it wasn't like a gradual sort of thing. It was just suddenly just a collapse, is the best way I can describe it. So there was a real sort of a break in terms of my life one day, and my life, shortly thereafter was not the same.
So how do you get up from the sofa and decide that you're not going to take a particular approach, make a choice not to go a certain
Yeah.
way, but choose to go another way. I mean, that is resilience. I understand that,
Yeah.
but how do you, when you look back on it now, how did you get to that?
It was just, and I suppose part of it was just not wanting to ever give up and not wanting to. I had a younger brother, um, and I didn't want to do that to my family and the family I had left, such as they were. Like we were kind of fractured at that point. And I had relatives on my dad's side that were still alive. Many of them are not anymore at this point, but I mean, it was just something because I suppose one of the reasons was I know what losing my mother, my aunt. I
Mm,
wasn't alive when my grandmother died, but losing my mother in particular, I know what it did to us, and I didn't want to do that. And I
mm,
just had an inner. I had enough inner motivation to keep going because I like at the end of the day, Chris, I guess the way to phrase it would be I wanted to live.
mm-hmm.
I chose to live. I chose to get up every day and live. And I found something to live for.
Yeah.
You
You've
know, I did.
Years later, here you are, married, child.
Yeah,
You've written a
grown child
story.
now.
You've shared it. Has she read it?
My wife has. Um, my daughter has not yet, although she's aware of most of what transpired. You know, one of the things we made sure to tell her about was how my mother died.
Mm,
She, of course, never knew her. My mother died in 1995.
mm,
Emily was born, our daughter was born in 2005. So she, of course, never met her, but she did meet my father. Dad died in 2007, so she was very young when
mhm.
my daughter was born. So she remembers him a little bit. She likes to she likes to say she remembers him, and I think she does that for my benefit. She doesn't really remember him. She was still very young
Hmm.
when he died.
What do you think she'll say if and when she reads this?
I don't know. I think that you know, I'm not really sure. I've tried to, one of the things I've always tried to do in raising her and being a husband and a father is to break a cycle, which wasn't necessarily
Mm,
chief at the top of my mind, consciously, but I've just always had held that close to my chest as something I wanted to do, and I wanted to do better. And I've been told by you know people that I've met, some people in the spiritual community that I've met, and so on, that
mm,
I am kind of that person. I'm that person in my family
mm,
that's broken some cycles, and it's not been easy. I it's taken a long time, and I don't know what she'll say, but I do know that I think some of it will be difficult. It will be hard for her. When we told her about my mother, she was about 15 or 16 when we told her how my mother died. It was a very emotional experience for her. And we've, of course, shown her pictures, and she's seen many pictures of my mother, and she has some of my mother in her, some of my father, of course, me. So it was a very emotional thing for her. But we thought it was important for her to understand that because I didn't want to keep that a secret. And at some point, things come out. And I found out about my older brother. He's my half brother. I just call him my brother. I knew about him when I was 17, 18 years old, but not before that.
mhm.
So that came as a bit of a surprise to me when I found out about that. My dad and I and one of his friends were out shopping for cars for me one day, and he just kind of dropped that on us in the bar when we were having a drink after an afternoon of car shopping. And I was like, uh, what? Because at that time, at least I didn't, for a long, long time, you think of your father as your father, your mother as your mother. You don't really think about them as people that have lives aside from those roles they carry in your life. So there was a bit of a shock, and I didn't want her to come about this in a shocking way. And I thought it was important for her to understand that part of my family. And that was kind of why we told her. So um, my wife has read it. She knows all this stuff. I told her everything, many years ago when we met. And she thought it was well written, and she was happy to read it. And I have friends of mine who have read it who have also found it to be emotional.
Yes.
Um,
And
and
Dean,
some of
just
them I've known for a long time.
I am going to include the link to the article in the
Oh,
description of
great.
this video. So for those who want to see that as well. You've said an interesting, and I think probably the key point in all of this is you chose to break the cycle. And there is some unconsciousness or subconsciousness there for sure at an earlier stage.
Mhm.
But now at this age and stage, that seems very conscious. And I'm interested in
It is.
hearing how you got to that. How did you
Well, it's
get
very
to that level of
deliberate.
consciousness?
It's very deliberate. So, and it's deliberate in ways that are maybe obvious and some that probably aren't. And one of those ways that is obvious is I'm not an alcoholic. I certainly partied when I was younger. I probably spilled more than a lot of people drank. I had my, there are things I did, friends, and I did things I probably shouldn't have survived. Let's put it that way. That was over by the time I was in my late teens, early 20s. I just was not interested. I started to work out and train, and I had some very good friends who got me into that, and
Mm.
that had an impact on me. And it was never really something that I felt I could not stop doing or that I needed to get through a day. Where my father, he needed it to get through a day, much like his smoking habit. So he had a very addictive kind of personality, and I'm not that way. For a while I would buy a bottle of wine and drink a bottle of wine over a couple of days, and I was trying different wines, and I would just enjoy it. My dad was a rum drinker. I never was. I drank vodka. I did the hard stuff, but I've never. It's not something I've never felt I could not control or manage, and I've
Dean,
never
I'm
smoked.
going to ask you to summarize a little bit because this certainly is a story that moved me to want to share it. So I have done that, and putting it into this format certainly is another way for us to get the message out there about choices, about resilience, and about that tactical, if you will, approach, which is to try and break a cycle, trying to be conscious about breaking a cycle. If there was one thing, and I know that's maybe hard to do, but if there was one thing you'd like to leave with someone today who is watching this and maybe going through their own family struggles as well, I think we all have versions of this, not maybe to this extent. What would that be? What could that be?
Well, I learned a lot of things over the past few years, and I underwent some other coaching and training, which is what allowed me to find out a lot about this subconscious, the role of the subconscious, and all of that. And one of the things that I learned that stuck with me, and this has been some learnings I've done over the past few years, which have been very difficult, but very worthwhile. And one of those things that has always stuck with me is the power of choice, and we all have
Mm,
choice. And that extends to everything. Life is really about choice. So in any given moment, you have a choice to open one door or another, choose something that benefits you or something that doesn't. And you can start over. Every second, every instant, it really is a chance to start over. And choices that you make will determine which way you go in life and the things that you do or don't do. And there are some choices that are more important than others. Who we marry, for one thing, um, that's an important choice. And whether or not we choose to let outside factors have undue influence over us or control us, those are choices. And your personal power comes in making choices. We are autonomous beings, and we can choose how we react to things. And we don't, and as Stoicism says, we don't necessarily choose everything that happens. We cannot control everything that happens to us. It's not possible to do that. But we can choose how we respond, which is one of the core tenets of, I believe, of Stoicism. And something that I didn't really understand that when I was younger. My dad used to tell me stuff like that. And I went, yeah, okay, Dad, whatever. But I understand now what he means by that. I understand
And
what
Dean,
personal power is all about.
I think that's probably the lesson that I took away from this is you can listen to Stoicism, you can believe that you control your reaction to something on a very rational level. And
Mhm.
that's easy to do, right? You read the books, you do the exercises and all that stuff. But when it becomes emotional and you read a story like yours, that's where the transformation happens. Happens, certainly
Yeah.
happened for me. because you now have that pull from someone who's experienced it and is not afraid of sharing. So um, I want to thank you for that, because that is certainly something that is not easy to write, and it's certainly not easy to share in this particular context. And you've given this guy, let's leave it at that. You've given this guy something to really sink his emotional self into. And certainly you've affected one person at least so far, and that happens to be me. So listen, I want to thank you so much. This is Dean Love. You will have his link on the description of this video. And if you are so inclined, please take a listen, take a read to what Dean has written about choices. Big word, but what it does and what it has, the impact it has on your personal resilience. Thank you so much, Dean. We'll see you again. This is
Thank
Overheard
you.
Overnight.
Thank you.